Hi guys, welcome back to Sacred Vedic Astrology. My name is Samantha and I am a professional Vedic sidereal astrologer. So, today we're going to do a really important lesson in Vedic astrology about what causes marriage to come later on in the chart. All right, so we're going to analyze some different aspects that you will see in charts of those who get usually after their Saturn return, after about late 20s to early 30s, and why we can see this in charts. This is really important because timing is everything in life, and timing is everything in astrology. So, a lot of the times people want things to happen before it's their time astrologically for those things to unfold. So, for example, if someone has Saturn in the seventh and they get married before their Saturn return, more often than not, that's not going to necessarily be the right marriage. Someone has Kuja Dosha in their chart and they get married really young, they're probably going to be in some sort of toxic or chaotic relationship in some regard. This isn't to say that it's for every single case, but more often than not, you will find this in the astrological energy that if someone kind of forces something before it's the natural time for that thing to unfold, then it's not necessarily the right thing. So in this video, I want to show how we can see later marriage aspects in the astrological chart, and why it's good to know this about yourself is because we get really caught up in this idea of timelines and societal norms and pressure and all these things, right? The astrology is always astrologying in the sense that there is this sort of fate, there's this karma that we are working with in this lifetime. And what I've found is if you try to force something before it's time, before it's really the time for that thing to blossom, a lot of times we're forcing the wrong thing, right? So it's really cool to know astrologically when something is actually meant to or fated to happen a little bit later on in life, right? And we live in such an interesting time period and culture where a lot of people are choosing their own paths in this lifetime as well too, which I think is so cool and so important to understand as well too, because Vedic astrology is such an ancient system, and so a lot of times things that they talk about in the scriptures, ideas are a little bit outdated, right? So when we talk about marriage, seventh house of marriage, nowadays, some people don't even want to get married. Some people don't want to have kids, right? So it's really that choice is there. But when I talk about later delayed marriage, it can also just be later or delayed solid relationships where you're finding that person that feels like the one or your soulmate as well too. So keep that in mind. I'm using the term marriage because it's easier to talk about it in that sense. And today we are going to actually analyze Kourtney Kardashian's Vedic astrological chart because she has the perfect example of marriage that is later or delayed in the chart, right? She got married recently when she was, I believe, early 40s when she got married. And it was her first marriage, right? And the reason we can see that is because of so much of these delayed aspects for her seventh house and of her relationship sector of her chart. So I thought it'd be really fun for us to pull up a chart, analyze a chart to understand this in the Vedic chart and have something where we can use as an example instead of me just like talking about it without a clear example of how this is working. So I hope you guys enjoy this video. This is something that I really put time, energy, and effort into to find the right chart to analyze for this video. So I hope you guys enjoy it, and let's get right into it. Alright guys, so here we have Kourtney's Vedic astrological chart pulled up, and we're gonna really look to her seventh house to start. So if you guys are new to Vedic astrology, this is the D1. This is the D9 Navamsha, which is the marriage chart. The way that we use divisional charts in Vedic astrology is we are analyzing the divisional charts' houses for what they're good for. Okay, so the D1, we're really analyzing all of it, all aspects. This is like someone's, innate birth chart. And then the D9 Navamsha is what we're looking to for the spouse charts. So we always look to the seventh house and the D9 Navamsha because the D9 Navamsha is the spouse chart and the house of marriage is the seventh. So we'll get to that next. But let's start with analyzing the D1 and looking into what's going on in Courtney's chart that caused this later marriage in her life. Okay, so let's go over to that 7th house of Leo and see how we have Saturn retrograde conjuncting Rahu in the 7th house. So Saturn is what we are looking to as one of the main aspects that will cause a more delayed marriage in the chart, right? Why? Because Saturn is the energy of restrictions and delays, and the quote and the phrase goes, this is infamous if you are a Vedic astrologer, you know this quote, but the quote goes, Saturn delays but doesn't deny. So when Saturn sits in a house, aspects a house, it doesn't mean that it denies that energy from ever happening. It more so means that it delays it until someone is later on in their life, right? They say that Saturn matures at about, after someone's Saturn returns. So let's say like more into their 30s is when Saturn is more so maturing in the chart. So we also see this planet is retrograde, right? So it means that when a planet is retrograde, it's also even more so kind of slowing down. It's a little bit more delayed as well, too. Something that one of my teachers would tell me is that, like, when a planet is retrograde, it becomes a choice if that person wants to do it, right? So because Saturn is retrograde in the 7th of marriage, it becomes a choice for Courtney if she wants to be married. I'm sure, when she was with Scott, her previous relationship, there was probably a lot of discussions about it. Maybe she was hesitant. That's that planet retrograde in the 7th house of marriage, meaning that it's a choice for her and it's not necessarily something that she has to do in this lifetime. Okay. So we see that Saturn sits in the 7th, and Saturn in the 7th, Saturn aspecting the 7th, or Saturn in the 7th or aspecting the 7th house ruler is really what we are looking for to see delayed marriage, right? And we want to look to the D1 and the D9. So Saturn's in the 7th gives delayed marriage or marriage that's later on. Saturn is retrograde, meaning that it's a choice. We see it with Rahu. Rahu is, sometimes a little bit malefic. I see Ketu as more malefic, but because Rahu is with Saturn in the 7th, it's not, the energy of like, oh my God, that's just the most seamless, easy marriage that comes really early on in life, right? We can see some of that malefic influence. And then we also see the 7th house lord. So 7th house is Leo, which means it gets disposited by the sun. So let's follow it over here. We see the 7th house lord goes into the 3rd house with the sun there in Aries. So what I find very, very interesting about this is 7th house lord in the 3rd house means that she can meet her spouse through a sibling. Younger sibling. 3rd house is the house of younger siblings. And I believe that I read that, Travis Barker was kind of around the family and he actually dated Kim Kardashian before getting married to Courtney. So that's a funny little thing there, is like the 7th house lord in the 3rd house of younger siblings. And there is a connection between her spouse and her younger sibling, Kim, right? So that's very interesting. But also there's that malefic influence because the 7th house is ruled by the sun. So we see a more malefic kind of influence on that 7th house lord, which, she did have a lot of struggles with her initial relationship, Scott. We see some malefic energy influencing that 7th house lord. So it's not a chart where marriage is just like easy breezy flowing to her, right? We see Saturn retrograde, we see Saturn with Rahu, and then we see the 7th house lord in the 3rd house with that sun, which is malefic. Okay. Now, what's interesting as well, too, is we hop over to her D9 Navamsha and we go to the 7th house here and we see that Saturn is once again retrograde with Jupiter in the 7th. So Jupiter is also the Karaka for marriage in the chart, and Saturn is again in that 7th house, right? So that shows that we are getting Saturn twice. So we see the energy of delayed marriage twice in the chart. We see it once in the D1 and then a second time in the D9. So that is giving this sort of delayed energy to marriage in the chart because Saturn just takes a longer time to mature and to develop as well too. Now, the other reason why we can see delayed marriage and more issues around relationships is because Courtney also has what's known as Kuja Dosha in Vedic astrology. So Kuja dosha is when Mars or Mangala goes into the first house, the second house, the fourth house, the seventh house, the eighth house, or the 12th house of the birth chart. And we see that Mars is in her second, in her D1. So we get Kuja dosha as well too. So Kuja dosha will show that someone can have, issues with relationships, issues with marriage, or a more delayed relationship or delayed marriage. It's said, that it's supposed to come after like the maturation of Mars, which would be after the age of 28. But I've found a lot of people with Kuja dosha find relationships or get married even later on than that in their life as well too. So Kuja dosha is kind of a popular thing that we will see in someone's chart. That's why, again, I made a previous video where I said that like Kuja dosha to me only really works if we see other malefic influence onto the 7th house. So if someone has things like Saturn, Rahu in the 7th, Saturn in the 7th in the D9, and then we also see Kuja dosha, we are going to get that more delayed or malefic influence onto marriage and relationships in the chart. So it just takes, it takes multiple aspects for that to really unfold is what I have found. It's not just if someone has Kuja dosha, oh my God, they're cursed in love. No, I would see it as them also having to have other malefic influence that will give a more delayed relationship or marriage as well too. So then we see Kuja dosha with Mars in the second. So see how we have all these various factors that are showing us a more delayed or slow to develop marriage. And then we also see Jupiter is with Saturn in the 7th, and Jupiter is the marriage house as well too. And then we see once again that 7th house lord and the D9 goes into the 4th with the sun there. So the sun is really involved in both her charts, meaning that we get a little bit of that malefic influence again in the first chart and the second chart, which is that spouse chart as well too. So really interesting, right, to see that Kourtney Kardashian has Saturn in the 7th in the D1, Saturn in the 7th in the D9, and then Kuja dosha. So we see these three various factors that can give delayed marriage is showing up in her charts, right? And she did have a delayed marriage. Again, things are so different in modern day society, but based on her chart, she would be seen as someone who had a delayed or later marriage that came about because of those various factors, right? And something I find very interesting actually is when looking to like what would Kourtney Kardashian's spouse or marriage partner end up being like. This is really funny because there's so much of that sun influence on the D1 and the D9 with the 7th house ruler. The sun shows someone in the spotlight, someone confident, someone who's seen, right? That sun shows power, confidence, and she ended up with someone in the spotlight. 3rd house is also performing and creativity, and she ended up with a creative performing person, right? It's the person that she ended up with is very musically gifted and he's very creative and all these things. And then we also see that because we see the dark Karaka or the indicator of the spouse is Venus in the 2nd. So Venus is also the Karaka or the indication of the arts and the creative and all those things as well too. And Travis Barker, the man that she ended up with is a musician who is in this like really well-known rock band, right? So that's showing all that energy of, the dark Karaka Venus. And what's funny is it's in the 2nd, and the 2nd house is the voice, and 2nd house is, expressing and all those themes as well too. So it's interesting that she ended up with someone who's in music, right? With dark Karaka Venus in the 2nd. And something that is also interesting is, Mars, Venus can also show us very much like what we're attracted to, and it's in that 2nd house. So she's also very attracted to people who are financially secure. She'll find a theme in her relationships of money being a huge theme as well too. But I've said this before, Venus, Mars in a conjunction can give very, intense arguments in relationships. And her initial relationship with Scott before she got married to Travis was very fiery, very argumentative. They were constantly arguing. There was always these like ups and downs, right? That's Mars with Venus. Venus-Mars gives a lot of passion in relationships, arguing. And then we also see that Kuja dosha, which is said to give a lot of passion and intensity and aggression in relationships, right? So she definitely has a theme of unraveling these relationship dynamics where there's a lot of like fiery, feisty, sort of argumentative energy that she kind of needs to, develop or work on in this lifetime and try to not get so lost in those more toxic dynamics where they're like screaming and they're fighting so much with that Venus, Mars, and then Kuja Dosha as well too. So we see a lot of that energy in the chart, but I do like the dark arc of Venus in the second for getting a creative partner, and he probably like speaks very like poetically to her at times. Venus in the second is like poetry, so that's very interesting. And then the seventh house lord in the third house, again, she met him and he was connected to her siblings, younger siblings, with that seventh house lord in the third house. And then seventh house lord in the third house also gives an energy of a lot of like communication in the relationship. So they probably got along well because they really communicated and talked, and all those themes we can see as well too. So that's really, exactly who she married. That's exactly how everything went about. So things that we are looking for in the chart for more delayed marriage is Saturn in the seventh, in the D1 or the D9, and in her chart we see it in the D1 and the D9, which is very powerful. Another thing we're looking for is Kuja Dosha, which she has with Mars in the second, and another thing we would look for is the seventh house lord having Saturn in it or aspecting it, right? So for her seventh house lord, is the sun in both the D1 and D9. So because she has Saturn in the seventh, in the D1 and D9, we don't have to look for that seventh house lord because it's already so prominent with having it twice. And then we also see Saturn retrograde, which means we have this even slower energy about it. And it also means that's more of a choice in this lifetime. So when a planet is retrograde, again, what James Braha taught me in one of my Vedic astrology courses was that when a planet is retrograde, that house and that energy becomes a choice, meaning that the person isn't jumping into marriage. They're not jumping into it. It's more so a choice if they choose to work with that planetary energy or not, okay? And it can be something that comes to them later on in life as well, too, with that retrograde Saturn. All right. So yeah, we see all those themes in the chart, and it's very, very spot on. It's very specific, and this is interesting. This is going to be a little bit more high level Vedic astrology, so I don't want to confuse you guys too much, but when I was looking to the time period in which she did get married, it was in her Rahu Saturn Dosha, which, I mean, you just can't make this stuff up. Okay. Saturn and Rahu is both in her seventh house in her D1 of marriage. When she goes into a Saturn Rahu Dasha in 2021, she gets married. And then in her D9 of Amsha, Saturn's in her seventh house. And they say that when you go into the house that a divisional chart is all about, that energy gets active. So when we're looking into the divisional chart of the D9 of Amsha, we want to see when the seventh house gets active. Okay, and so it would be when Jupiter is active in the Dasha, or Saturn is active in the main Dasha or the Bhukti, and, they met and really had their relationship unravel between about 2019, which is when Jupiter gets highlighted, into 2021, which is when Saturn gets highlighted. So we see that seventh house Bhukti ruling planet get active. So, it highlights her entire seventh house in the Dasha sequence in both the D1 and the D9 when she got married, and it's not what you would naturally intuit as the Dasha sequence of like, when is someone going to get married, because Saturn and Rahu can both be more malefic influence, but because it activates her seventh house of marriage in both the D1 and the D9, best believe it starts highlighting and activating those themes as well too. Okay. And another little trick is when we are counting from the main Dasha to the Bhukti ruling planet, we want to see it go into a 1 relationship or a 7 relationship in the main Dasha to the Bhukti ruler, right? So Rahu to Saturn, Rahu sits with Saturn in the D1. So it means that that's making a 1-1 relationship, meaning we count how far does Rahu go to Saturn. It goes into the same house. It's a conjunction. So it's like a 1-7 aspect in the Dasha sequence as well too. So again, it's not what we would naturally intuit for marriage, Saturn and Rahu, right? But that is exactly how it went about. And what's interesting as well, too, is she is an Aquarius Lagna and ascendant. So her whole chart is actually ruled by Saturn, right? Which means that her whole chart gets ruled by the 7th house. So when she goes into a Saturn Dosha, her 7th house gets really active because it's her first house lord in the 7th. Okay? And for Aquarius ascendant, Saturn in that 7th really highlights that first 7th axis in the doshas, which is all about relationships and marriage as well too. All right, guys, so I hope you enjoyed this analysis of what we are looking to for delayed marriage. Again, we're looking to Saturn in the 7th in the D1 or the D9. If we see it in the D1 and the D9, best believe we would advise someone to wait for marriage until they're out of their Saturn return. We are looking to Kuja Dosha, which also can delay marriage and relationships, which she has as well too. And we are also looking at the 7th house ruler to see if Saturn is sitting there aspecting as well too, which we don't have to look to in her chart because she already has Saturn with Rahu in the D1 and then Saturn with Jupiter in the D9. So we see that influence twice. And then we also get Kuja Dosha, so we wouldn't even have to worry about the 7th house lord because there's already so many other obvious aspects that are showing this as well too. All right, and also what you will find is when people are ruled by Saturn in general, so because she's an Aquarius ascendant, her whole chart does get ruled by Saturn itself, that those charts will find that their life is a little bit more delayed because it's, Saturn is, again, that energy of delays but doesn't deny. So I hope you guys enjoyed this chart analysis into what causes delayed marriage. I thought her chart was just like a perfect example of that. And also, Venus, Darkarka, Venus conjunct Mars, she's attracted to creative partners. Then she ended up with a musician, right? That is that. Mercury's retrograde, that is that right there. So yeah, that's that. And then also the 7th house lord with the sun twice, giving a partner who is in the spotlight in some regard or is confident or is seen in some way. Okay. All right. I hope you guys enjoyed this chart analysis and learned something from it. And I'm sending all the best vibes. I hope you guys have a beautiful, blessed day or evening whenever you're watching this. And I love y'all. Comment, like, and subscribe for more content coming as well soon. Love you guys.